town mocked her size. "You're a feast," the deadly tracker vowed. She was on her knees in the wreckage of everything she had ever built, her hands bleeding from the shattered glass when the door swung open and he walked in. Cole Maverick, the most dangerous man in 3 counties. He stood in the doorway of her ruined apothecary, and Clara Whitfield watched his jaw go tight, watched something cold and lethal move behind his eyes like a storm rolling in over flat Texas land. The mayor had done this. Everyone in Oakhaven knew it, but knowing and proving were 2 very different things, and Clara, kneeling in the ash and debris of her life's work, had just found the proof. Before we ride into this story together, I want to invite you to stay until the very end. If this tale moves you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Oakhaven, Texas, in the autumn of 1875, was the kind of town that grew faster than its conscience. It had sprung up almost overnight along a dusty crossroads in the heart of the hill country, fed by cattle drives and ambition and the particular restlessness of men who had survived the war and needed somewhere new to be lost. Within 5 years, it had a bank, 2 saloons, a church with a leaking roof, a general store run by a man who watered down his molasses, and 1 apothecary on the prime corner of Main and Sycamore, operated by a woman who had no business being as good as she was at keeping people alive. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she was 28 years old, and she had come to Oakhaven with nothing but a mule, a crate of reference texts, and the kind of stubborn competence that a certain type of person mistakes for arrogance, simply because they cannot explain it. She had trained under an apothecary in San Antonio for 6 years, had read every medical text she could get her hands on, and had a memory for dosage and herb interaction that bordered on the supernatural. She could look at a man's eyes and tell you whether his liver was failing. She could smell infection before a wound turned. She had saved the lives of people who had never once thanked her for it, and she had kept their secrets, and she had charged them fair prices, and she had asked for nothing in return except the right to do her work in peace. Oakhaven did not grant her that peace easily. Clara Whitfield was a powerfully built woman. She stood 5 feet 6 inches with a broad, solid frame, wide shoulders that had carried more than their share of weight, and the kind of generous full figure that the fashion plates in Eastern magazines seemed designed to make invisible. She had dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned back during work hours and warm brown eyes that missed very little. Her hands were strong and capable, and usually stained with some combination of charcoal, dried herb, or medicinal tincture. She was not a delicate woman. She had never pretended to be. But she was, in the way that truly mattered, a beautiful one. The town had made up its mind about her long before she had a chance to introduce herself. This was the nature of small places and small thinking. The women of the social set, led by Mayor Harlan Sterling's 2 daughters, Millicent and Josephine, had decided within her first month in Oakhaven that Clara Whitfield was not the right kind of woman. She was too large, too self-sufficient, too uninterested in the rituals of diminishment that polished society required of its female members. She did not lace herself into a corset until she could barely breathe. She did not flutter. She did not defer. And so they made her pay for it in the currency of whispers. At Sunday services, she sat alone. At the dry goods counter, conversation shifted when she entered. Millicent Sterling, who had the particular talent of the malicious for locating and pressing on a bruise, had a habit of looking Clara over with a slow, deliberate gaze whenever they passed on the boardwalk, the kind of look that was meant to communicate without words that she had been measured and found excessive. Clara had learned over 2 years to keep her face composed during these moments. She had learned to carry herself as though the gaze slid off her like water off oilcloth. But in the quiet of her back room in the hours after closing, when she sat with her ledger and her tea, she knew what the looks cost her. She knew the particular loneliness of being needed desperately in the dark and dismissed casually in the daylight. Because that was the other thing about Oakhaven. The same women who looked through Clara on Sunday morning sent their housemaids to her back door on Tuesday night. The banker's wife, the judge's sister, the preacher's daughter. They came to her for the things they could not discuss in polite company. Difficult pregnancies, monthly cramps so severe they could not rise from bed, husbands with conditions they had picked up in towns far from home. They came to her because she knew, and she was discreet, and she was brilliant, and they trusted her completely. They just did not want anyone to know they trusted her. Clara accepted this arrangement because she was practical. The income kept her shop solvent, the work kept her mind occupied, and there was a part of her, the part she did not examine too closely, that understood that being needed even secretly was better than not being needed at all. Her shop was her sanctuary. She had built it herself, or nearly so, hiring 2 carpenters for the heavy work and doing the rest with her own hands. The front room smelled of dried lavender and camphor and the faint sweetness of beeswax. Bundles of herbs hung from the low rafters. Glass jars lined the shelves in orderly rows, each labeled in her precise, clear handwriting. There was a small oak counter with a worn surface where she mixed and measured, and behind it a curtained doorway that led to her workroom, and beyond that, her small living quarters. She had a cat named Aristotle who slept on the windowsill and regarded customers with profound suspicion. She had a rocking chair by the back window where she read in the evenings. She had a small iron stove that she kept burning through the cold months. She had built a life here inside these 4 walls that was genuinely hers, and she was more fiercely protective of it than she would ever have admitted aloud. It was into this life 2 years ago that Cole Maverick had first walked. He had come in on a gray November evening near closing time with his hat pulled low and a laceration on his forearm wrapped badly in a strip of shirt linen. He had not said much. He had set $2 silver on the counter and told her in a voice that came out rough and low as gravel shifting that he needed the wound cleaned and closed and that he did not want to see the town doctor. Clara had looked at him for a moment. She had seen the gun at his hip and the way he stood with his back already angled toward the wall, and she had made the professional assessment that this was a man who had been in enough trouble that he no longer noticed he was doing it. She had cleaned and closed the wound. She had not asked what caused it. She had charged him a fair price, given him a small tin of healing salve, and told him to come back in 4 days if it showed signs of fever. He had come back in 4 days. The wound was clean. He had not said anything except thank you, and he had set another coin on the counter and he had left. She had thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Cole Maverick was, by the autumn of 1875, one of the most effective bounty trackers in the Texas Hill Country. He worked alone. He had a reputation for bringing men in alive when the law required it, and for bringing them in the other way when circumstances demanded, and for never losing a target once he had accepted a contract. He was 36 years old and looked in certain lights somewhat older because the work had carved itself into his face. He was tall and lean and dark, with the kind of stillness about him that animals and experienced gunmen both recognized as dangerous. There was a scar that ran from his left cheekbone down toward his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight 5 years past, and several others distributed across his forearms, and one at the base of his throat that he did not discuss. He had no home in the conventional sense. He had a horse named Breckenridge, a bedroll, and a set of saddlebags. He slept under the sky more often than under a roof. He ate when he caught something, or when he passed through a town, and he drank occasionally, and moderately, because he had seen what the other kind of drinking did to men who carried guns. He moved through the Texas landscape like weather present, and then gone noticed only in his passage. Oakhaven was a waypoint for him. It sat at a useful junction between 3 counties where trouble tended to concentrate, and it had a livery he trusted and a saloon where he could get information without being required to provide much in return. He had been using it as a transit point for 3 years before Clara arrived. He would not have been able to tell you precisely when he began timing his passages through Oakhaven to coincide with her shop hours. It had not been a conscious decision, or rather it had not begun as one. The first time he had simply needed salve and the doctor was closed. The second time her salve had worked considerably better than anything else he had tried. By the 5th time he was making adjustments to his route that had nothing to do with either salve or convenience. And he was not, if he was honest with himself, particularly interested in examining that fact too closely. There was something about her shop. The smell of it, the particular combination of camphor and dried sage and wood smoke from the iron stove. The quality of the quiet inside it, which was different from the quiet of open country, warmer somehow inhabited. He had spent so much time in places that were hostile or empty that a space which was neither had an almost physical effect on him, like stepping out of wind into shelter. And there was something about Clara herself that he could not name precisely in words, and did not try to. She was steady in a way that had nothing to do with timidity. She moved through her workspace with the confident economy of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had no interest in performing uncertainty for anyone's comfort. She asked him practical questions when she was tending to his injuries and did not ask personal ones. She treated him like a person who deserved basic dignity, which was more than most people in his life had managed. He watched the town treat her otherwise, and it produced in him a cold, quiet anger that he kept behind his teeth. He knew about her situation. He was, by professional necessity, a man who gathered information without appearing to, and Oakhaven was a small town. He knew about the Sterling daughters and their pointed silences. He knew about the night callers who used her back door. He knew that she sat alone at services and that she had not been invited to a single social function in 2 years, despite being, by any reasonable measure, one of the most valuable people in the entire county. He brought her things when he came back from his contracts. Medicinal plants he encountered on his travels, things she might not be able to source locally. Wild valerian from the river bottoms north of Austin. A particular variety of dried mushroom she had mentioned once while cataloging her stock. He left them on the counter without ceremony, as though they were simply part of a transaction, and she accepted them the same way, cataloging them with precise interest and adding their value to the running informal account she kept for him. He was not sure she understood that he was not doing it for credit. He was not entirely sure during those early months that he understood it himself. The night that changed things between them arrived on a Wednesday in late October, when a blue norther had come roaring down from the panhandle and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 2 hours. Clara had banked the stove and was preparing to close when the door opened and Cole Maverick fell across her threshold. He did not fall precisely. He caught the doorframe and held himself upright through what was clearly a significant exercise of will, but the expression on his face was wrong in a way that alarmed her immediately. He was pale under his weathered complexion, and his left side was dark with what she recognized at once as blood loss, and his eyes, when they found hers, had the unfocused quality of a man running on reserve. "I did not know where else to go," he said. Those were the last coherent words he managed for several hours. Clara did not waste time on questions. She got him through the curtain and into her workroom, which required considerably more physical effort than anything she had done that day, and which she accomplished through the simple application of her own substantial strength and a stubborn refusal to consider the alternative. She got his coat and shirt off, and found what she had suspected, a bullet wound in his left side through and through, by the grace of whatever providence watched over reckless men, but badly abraded, and already showing the early signs of the infection that the cold and the long ride had encouraged. She worked through the night. This was not unusual for Clara. She had worked through nights before over worse wounds than this one. But there was something different about this night, something in the quality of the labor, the particular focused intimacy of fighting to keep one specific person alive, when that person was this person. She cleaned the wound with carbolic solution. She sutured the internal layers with the small, precise stitches she had practiced on leather until they were perfect. She packed it and dressed it and set about managing the fever that rose steadily as the hours passed. He was not conscious exactly, but he was not fully unconscious either. He drifted in the borderland between them, and sometimes he murmured things she could not make out, and once he gripped her wrist with a hand that still had surprising strength in it, and said clearly, a name she did not recognize, and then let go. She changed his fever cloths every hour. She sat beside him on the low stool she used for close work, and monitored his breathing and his color and the slow, stubborn progress of the battle his body was waging. Aristotle, abandoning his usual reserve, had settled himself at the foot of the cot with the solemn air of a creature standing watch. Sometime near 3 a.m, in the deep, cold quiet of the norther's aftermath, Cole turned his face toward her. She had been changing the cloth at his forehead, leaning close, and he shifted in his half-consciousness and pressed his face against the soft, warm curve of her side, his forehead against the full roundness of her stomach, and he exhaled. It was the sound a man makes when he has been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and finally, in the fraction of a moment when his defenses are down, allows himself to let it go. "Only soft place," he murmured, his voice thick with fever, and something else, something that sounded like exhaustion deeper than sleep could reach. Only soft place in a hard world. Clara went very still. She did not move away from him. She told herself it was because any abrupt movement might worsen his condition. She told herself that, and she was not entirely wrong, but she was also not entirely right. She sat very still with his face pressed against her and her hand hovering near his forehead, and she felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a medical term for, which was unusual because she had a medical term for nearly everything. By morning the fever had broken. Clara had dozed once in the rocking chair and woken with a stiff neck and the particular bleak clarity of someone who had been awake through the small hours with a hard thing and survived it. Cole was asleep, genuinely asleep, his color better, his breathing even. She checked the wound and found it holding. She went to the front room and started the stove, and made coffee and stood at the window watching Oakhaven come alive in the gray morning light. She decided, not going to think about what he had said. It had been the fever talking. Men in fever said all manner of things that bore no relationship to their waking selves. She was a medical professional, and she understood this completely, and she was going to treat it as the medical symptom it was and proceed accordingly. She was also, she noticed with some irritation, still feeling the warmth of his breath through the fabric of her dress against her skin. Cole woke near noon. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the ceiling of her workroom with the careful blankness of a man assembling himself. Then he turned his head and found her where she sat at her work table with her mortar and pestle, and their eyes met. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever experienced. "You saved my life," he said finally. His voice was rough with sleep and recent fever. "I did," she agreed with professional composure that she was mildly proud of. "You will need to stay still for several days. The wound is closed, but the infection is not fully resolved. I will continue your treatment." He looked at her for another moment. Something moved in his eyes that she did not try to read. "Clara," he said, "do not," she said not unkindly, "try to talk your way out of following medical instructions. I have been up all night, and I am not in a tolerant frame of mind." Something shifted in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. He was quiet. He did what she told him. He stayed. And Oakhaven, which had spent 2 years looking at Clara Whitfield and seeing only what they had decided she went about its busy ordinary business entirely unaware that the equation of things was beginning slowly and irrevocably to shift. Cole stayed for 5 days. Clara told herself this was a medical necessity, and it was, but it was also, if she was being precise about it, something more complicated than that. He was a poor patient in the sense that he did not complain and did not ask for things, and lay with a stillness that was almost unnerving, the stillness of a man accustomed to waiting in silence for long stretches of time. He was an unexpectedly easy patient, in the sense that he did exactly what she told him to do, which was more than she could say for most of the men she had treated in Oakhaven, who seemed to believe that following medical instructions was a form of personal defeat. He slept a great deal the first 2 days, which was what she needed him to do. She checked his wound in the mornings and changed his dressings and left a cup of the willow bark tea she brewed for fever management on the crate beside his cot, and he drank it without being asked and without making the face that most people made about willow bark tea, which Clara privately considered a mark in his favor. On the 3rd day he was well enough to sit up, and she found him when she came through the curtain with his afternoon broth, examining the shelves of her workroom with quiet, careful attention. He was not touching anything. He was simply looking with the focused interest of a man who had learned to read his surroundings as a matter of survival, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen there before. Something that might have been wonder if wonder were something a man like Cole Maverick allowed himself. "You have vervain," he said without turning. "I do," she said. "It is difficult to source. I dry my own from a small cultivated patch behind the building. I saw some growing wild along the Pedernales 2 weeks back, north bank near the old crossing." She set the broth down on the crate and looked at him. "That is excellent information. The commercial supply has been unreliable." He turned then, and their eyes met across the small space of her workroom, and the silence had that quality again, the one she had been carefully not thinking about. He looked, she thought, somewhat different without the shadow of fever on him. More present, more himself. Whatever that self was, which she was beginning to suspect was considerably more layered than the dangerous minimal impression he presented to the world. "You catalogued everything," he said. "Every jar, every bundle." "Organization is the foundation of effective practice," she said. "If I cannot locate what I need in the dark with one hand, it is not organized." "The dark with one hand," he repeated slowly. "There are emergencies in this work that do not allow for light or leisure," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I believe that," and the way he said it made her understand that he was not simply agreeing with her statement. He was recognizing something, seeing her in some specific and particular way that she was not accustomed to being seen. She picked up her mortar and pestle and went back to work, because that was what she did when something became too warm to look at directly. On the 4th day he was well enough to sit in the front room, and he did in the chair she kept for waiting customers, and she worked at the counter while he sat there. It should have been strange. It was not strange. It was, and this was the unsettling part, entirely natural in the way that things are natural when they are filling a shape that was already there. He told her that afternoon in the abbreviated, unpracticed way of a man who did not volunteer information about himself easily about the plant he had seen near the Pedernales crossing, then about the country north of there, and the way the cedar brake gave way to open limestone plateau, and a particular morning he had spent on a bluff watching a thunderstorm move across the flats below. He was not a talkative man, but when he spoke about the landscape, something in him opened slightly like a window in a closed room. Clara listened. She measured and mixed and listened, and she asked 2 or 3 precise questions that made him look at her with a slight shift in his expression, as though he had expected her not to be interested or not to understand, and was adjusting his assessment. She knew she was doing something inadvisable. She was letting herself enjoy his presence. She was letting herself appreciate the particular quality of quiet that he brought into a room which was different from the vacancy of absence, more like the quiet of something large and patient and essentially benign if you knew how to read it. She was letting herself notice things. The way his hands rested on his knees, still but not tense. The low register of his voice when he spoke with no audience to perform for. The fact that when Aristotle, after a long period of suspicious observation, finally stepped off the windowsill and approached him, Cole extended one finger toward the cat without looking down and waited, and Aristotle, who had once hissed at the circuit judge, bumped his head against that finger with the air of a creature who had made a considered decision. She told herself it was the gratitude of a man who owed her his life. She told herself she was a practical woman who understood the difference between circumstances and meaning. She told herself these things with some frequency. She was in the middle of telling herself these things on the morning of the 5th day when the bell above her front door rang and Millicent Sterling walked in. Millicent was 24 years old and had her father's sharp eyes and her mother's pretensions and a tongue she used like a surgical instrument, with precision and without mercy. She came in ostensibly for a headache powder, which she could have obtained from the general store, but which she always purchased from Clara because Clara's formulation worked, and the general stores did not, a fact that Millicent managed to be grateful for while still resenting Clara for it. She set her reticule on the counter and looked at the front room. Cole was in the chair. He had his eyes half closed in the way he did when he was resting, but still aware, and he looked exactly like what he was, a large, scarred, dangerous man in a state of relative repose. Millicent's eyes moved from him to Clara and back with an expression that Clara recognized. It was the expression of a person who has found a piece of information they intend to use. "Miss Whitfield," Millicent said with the particular sweetness that preceded something unkind, "I did not realize you were providing boarding services in addition to your other enterprises." Clara looked at her steadily. "Headache powder, Miss Sterling. 2 cents. Of course." Millicent did not move toward the counter, though I must say I would have thought a woman in your position would be more careful about appearances. Keeping a man in your establishment. People will talk. "People in this town talk regardless of what I do," Clara said. "Your powder is ready." "Is it not a concern to you?" Millicent pressed with the avidity of a person who enjoys pressing. "Your reputation is already somewhat—" She did not finish the sentence. She let it trail, which was worse than finishing it, because it left room for Clara to fill in whatever she most feared. "Miss Sterling?" Cole's voice came from the chair low and unhurried, the way a river sounds before a falls. He had not moved, had not opened his eyes fully, but his voice had a quality that filled the room and required attention. "The lady asked you a direct question about a direct product. I would answer it." The room changed. Millicent Sterling looked at Cole. Maverick and Cole Maverick looked back at her with an expression of complete, mild, utterly implacable indifference. And Millicent Sterling was not a stupid woman. She picked up the headache powder, set her 2 cents on the counter, and left. The bell above the door rang her out. Clara stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the worn oak surface. She was aware that her heartbeat had done something irregular. She was aware that she was annoyed because she had handled Millicent Sterling on her own for 2 years and did not need assistance. And she was also aware with a honesty that cost her something that watching Cole Maverick dismantle that particular cruelty with 8 quiet words had produced in her a feeling she did not have a medical term for either. "I fight my own battles," she said without turning. "I know," he said. "I did not fight that one. I just took up space." She turned and looked at him. He met her gaze with that same stillness. "There is a difference," he said, "between fighting for someone and simply being present while they fight. I know which one you need." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to her work, because what else was there to do? But the architecture of something between them had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them spoke of it, because speaking of it would have required a vocabulary that neither of them had quite assembled yet. He left the next morning. He had a contract waiting, he said, and he had stayed longer than he could afford. He was at the door with his saddlebags and his coat and his hat, and she stood at the counter with her arms crossed, in the way she crossed them when she was keeping herself contained, and she gave him the salve she had prepared for his continued wound care and the list of instructions for his recovery that she had written out in her precise handwriting. He took them. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his breast pocket close. She noticed this and noted it and said nothing. "The Vervain," he said, "north bank of the Pedernales, near the old crossing, before the first real freeze." "I know," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. He went out the door. Through the window she watched him collect Breckenridge from the livery, watched the horse toss his head in greeting, watched Cole settle into the saddle with the careful movement of a man managing a healing wound. He did not look back at her window. She told herself she had not expected him to. It was in the weeks following Cole's departure that Mayor Harlan Sterling began his campaign in earnest, though campaign was perhaps too generous a word for what it was. It was a systematic, carefully managed piece of social cruelty, and if you did not know to look for the architect behind it, it appeared to be nothing more than the natural drift of a small town's opinion. It began with the gossip which was not new, but which suddenly had more velocity. Mrs. Pruitt, the wife of the alderman, mentioned in 3 separate social settings that it was a shame about the apothecary that a woman running a business alone on a prime corner lot was all very well, but perhaps not the most suitable arrangement for a growing town that needed to attract proper investment. Someone mentioned in the context of the New Church Ladies' Auxiliary that it had always seemed a little irregular, a woman of Clara's particular type, living and working alone, no family connections, no social supervision to speak of. The someone was always just vague enough that you could not trace it back to its origin. This was the mayor's particular skill. He had been in local politics for 11 years, and he had learned that a rumor you could trace was a liability, while a rumor that simply seemed to emerge from the general sentiment of a community was a tool. Clara noticed the shift. She was too observant not to. The morning foot traffic in her shop thinned. The women who had nodded to her at the dry goods counter stopped nodding. 2 families who had used her services for minor ailments appeared instead at the office of Dr. Harmon Blythe, the town's physician, a man whose primary qualifications seemed to be a medical degree from a school she had never heard of and the right kind of surname. What she did not know, because the mayor had been very careful about what he allowed to surface, was why. The why was sitting in a surveyor's report in the locked drawer of Mayor Sterling's desk on the 2nd floor of the town hall. The report, commissioned 6 months prior through an intermediary in Austin, indicated that the proposed route of the San Antonio and Brazos River Railroad would require a depot and service facility on the west side of Oakhaven. And the most advantageous location for that facility, the location that would command the highest sale price and the most favorable terms, was the corner of Main and Sycamore, the corner that Clara Whitfield's apothecary occupied. The railroad money was the kind of money that changed the scale of a man's life entirely. The mayor had done his arithmetic. He knew what the land was worth to the tycoons in Austin who were driving the expansion, and he knew what he could clear on the transaction, and he knew that he needed Clara Whitfield gone before the deal could be formalized. He needed her gone willingly, ideally, because a woman who dug her heels in and contested a forced purchase could slow things down considerably and attract the kind of attention he preferred to avoid. So he had set about making Oakhaven small for her, smaller than it already was. Clara did not know the specific mechanism. She knew the effect. She felt it in the way the air in a room changed when she entered. She felt it in the silence at the dry goods counter and the deliberate absence of invitations that had never been extended warmly to begin with. She felt it most acutely on a Sunday morning in mid-November when she walked out of church services to find that someone had painted the word unwanted on the front step of her shop in red paint, low and quick, clearly done in the night. She stood looking at it for a long moment in the cold morning air. Then she went inside, got her scrubbing brush and lye soap, and removed it. It took 40 minutes. She did not cry while she was doing it. She did not cry afterward either because she did not have the time, and because she was not going to give whoever had done it that particular satisfaction. But her hands, when she finally put the brush away, were shaking. She was behind the counter that same afternoon when the door opened and a cowhand named Russ Decker came in. Decker was a large, slope-shouldered man with a drink problem, and the particular loud confidence of a man who had never once been told that his opinion was not required. He had been in her shop twice before, for liniment both times unremarkable, but today he was not entirely sober, and had apparently decided in the way that this type of man sometimes decided that Clara Whitfield was the appropriate target for whatever was festering in him that afternoon. He leaned against the counter and looked her over with a slowness that was designed to be demeaning, and then he said loudly enough that the two other customers in the shop could hear that it was a wonder her floorboards held, and that he supposed a woman her size could always fall back on being useful as a load-bearing wall. The two other customers went very still. Clara set down what she was measuring. She looked at Decker with the expression she had cultivated over 2 years of this kind of thing, a look of such measured, controlled disdain that it should have been enough to make a man of any perceptiveness whatsoever reconsider his position. Decker was not a man of perceptiveness whatsoever. He opened his mouth to add something further, and the back door opened, and Cole Maverick walked in. He had been back in the town for 2 hours. He had arrived quietly, as he always did, and come through the alley to her back entrance, which she had told him once was unlocked during business hours because she sometimes needed deliveries brought through when the front was busy. He had intended to tell her he was back, to leave the dried valerian root he had found on his last passage through the river country on her work table, and then to collect some salve and continue about his business. He stood in the curtained doorway and took in the scene in the front room with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a man whose survival had always depended on reading a situation faster than it could develop. He looked at Decker. He looked at Clara, at her hands flat on the counter, and the controlled stillness of her expression and the slight whiteness around her knuckles. He looked at the two other customers pressed back toward the wall. He came through the curtain and crossed the room and took hold of Decker's arm at the elbow with a grip that was not rough but was entirely inescapable, the way a vice is neither rough nor escapable. And he walked Decker to the door in 3 unhurried steps and put him through it with the measured ease of a man moving a piece of furniture that needed to be elsewhere. Then he came back to the counter. Clara looked at him. Her chin was up and her eyes were bright, and she said with a controlled fury that had been building for considerably longer than this afternoon, "I do not need you to do that. I have handled men like that for 2 years on my own, and I am fully capable of continuing to do so." Cole looked at her. He was closer to the counter than was strictly necessary, and she was aware of his height and the breadth of his shoulders and the particular focused quality of his attention, all of it directed at her, and it was a great deal to have directed at you all at once. "I know you are," he said. His voice was quiet and undefensive. "I know that completely." "Then why?" she said. He was close to the counter now, very close, and she had not stepped back, which was either courage or stubbornness or something else entirely, and his eyes were on hers with an expression that was not like anything she had seen on his face before. "I am not protecting your honor, Clara. he said, low and deliberate, as though each word had been considered and selected with care. "I am protecting the only woman I have ever wanted to ruin myself for." The two remaining customers discovered simultaneously that they had completed their business and needed to be elsewhere. The bell above the door rang twice in quick succession, and then it was quiet. Clara stood behind her counter with her hand still flat on the worn oak surface and her heart doing something that was entirely outside her medical expertise. To explain, and she looked at Cole Maverick, who looked back at her with an expression of complete, terrifying, unguarded honesty, and the silence between them was not empty at all. It was full of every conversation they had not had, and every moment that had passed in this small, herb-scented room over 2 years of dusk visits and careful hands and things left on counters without ceremony. She did not know what to say. She, who had a term for everything, who had built her whole life on the precision of language applied to need, could not find a single word that was adequate to this moment. Cole did not push it. He did not press his advantage, if that was what it was. He simply held her gaze for one more long moment, and then he straightened slightly, and the thing in his expression shifted back. Not gone, but contained like a door that has been opened a crack to show you the light inside, and then eased, mostly closed again. "The valerian is on your work table," he said. "North Bank, like I said. Good yield this year." And he turned and went back through the curtain, and she heard the back door close behind him. Clara stood at her counter for a long time after that. Outside, Oakhaven went on being Oakhaven, dusty and indifferent, and full of its small cruelties and its invisible machinations. Inside the jars on her shelves stood in their orderly rows, each labeled in her precise handwriting, each containing something that could heal the right wound in the right hands. She was thinking about what he had said. She was thinking about what she believed it meant, and what she feared it meant, and what she wanted it to mean, and how those three things were not the same thing, and how she had spent 2 years becoming very skilled at ensuring that what she wanted did not trespass too far into what she allowed herself to expect. She was also thinking with the part of her mind that never stopped being an apothecary that the valerian was on her work table, and that it had come from exactly where he said it would be, because he had remembered, because he had gone out of his way, because he had been paying a very specific kind of attention to her for a very long time. Aristotle jumped onto the counter and sat in front of her and looked at her with the yellow-eyed, unblinking assessment of a creature who had made his own judgment about this situation some considerable time ago. "Do not look at me like that," Clara told him. Aristotle looked at her exactly like that. Outside, the November wind moved through Oakhaven and rattled the sign above her door, and the day went on, and the thing that had been building quietly in this small shop on the corner of Main and Sycamore continued to build whether Clara Whitfield was ready for it or not. The days that followed had a strange suspended quality, like the sky in the hour before a storm. When the air goes still, and the light turns copper, and you know something is coming, but you cannot yet name its shape. Cole did not leave Oakhaven immediately. His next contract was not urgent, or at least that was what he told himself, and he found reasons to remain that he did not examine too closely. He took a room at the boarding house on Elm Street, which was unusual for him. He typically slept in the livery, or not at all. He told Mrs. Garland, the boarding house keeper, that he needed a proper bed while his wound finished healing, which was true enough to satisfy him. He came to the apothecary each morning, not at dusk as he once had, but in the daylight openly, and he stayed for varying stretches of time. Sometimes he sat in the front room chair and was simply present while Clara worked. Sometimes he brought things a length of oak board he had noticed needed replacing on her back step, a new hinge for the workroom door that had been stiff since September. He fixed these things without being asked and without making any ceremony about it. He simply arrived with the materials and did the work, and Clara let him, because the backstep genuinely needed replacing, and because she had the self-awareness to recognize that refusing his help on principle was a form of pride she could not entirely afford. She was also, if she was honest, beginning to lose the ability to sustain her own argument against him. The argument had always run something like this. He was a dangerous man of violent profession who moved through the world untethered. She was a practical woman with a permanent address and a business to maintain. The things he had said to her were the product of circumstances of fever and gratitude and proximity and a hardened man of action who could have any number of more suitable women who were slender and composed and fit, the silhouette that 1875 Texas considered correct, would not, when the fever cleared and the gratitude faded, remain interested in someone of her particular construction. This argument had seemed sound when she first assembled it. It was becoming less sound with daily exposure to evidence that contradicted it, because Cole Maverick looked at her, not in the way men sometimes looked at women who made them uncomfortable, the quick glance that slid away before it could be accused of anything. He looked at her directly and steadily with the same quality of attention he brought to reading a landscape, as though he was genuinely interested in what he was seeing and had no inclination to pretend otherwise. When she spoke, he listened with his whole body oriented toward her. When she moved through her shop, his eyes tracked her with an awareness that was not predatory, but was entirely deliberate, and she had enough medical knowledge about the human nervous system to understand what that kind of deliberate attention meant in a man who was in all other respects economical with his responses to the world. It was during this period that he began bringing her the medicinal plants in earnest. Not just the occasional specimen, but a consistent, thoughtful supply that told her he was actively seeking them out on his travels. Wild ginger from the creek bottoms east of town. A bundle of dried bone set that she had mentioned needing 3 weeks prior. One morning he arrived with a small clay pot containing a live specimen of a woody herb she had only read about in her reference texts, and she stood holding it in both hands with an expression that she was not entirely in control of, and he watched her face with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has correctly identified the precise gift. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Mexican side of the river," he said. "There is a woman there, a curandera, who grows it. I told her what it was for. She said to tell you it prefers morning shade." Clara looked up from the plant. "You described my work to her." "I described you," he said. "There was no performance in it. It was a statement of fact, delivered in his usual way, and it landed in her chest with the quiet, specific weight of something true." She looked back down at the plant. "Thank you, Cole," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it, and neither of them acknowledged it, but it stayed in the room after she said it, like the scent of something warm. The harvest dance was Oakhaven's annual capitulation to the idea that a cattle town on the edge of the hill country could for one evening pretend to be something more refined. It was held in the town hall, which was swept and decorated with dried corn and late autumn wildflowers, and the whole of Oakhaven's social body attended because attendance was both entertainment and performance. And the two were in Oakhaven rarely separated. Clara had attended the previous year's dance alone, and left early after spending 45 minutes standing at the edge of the room while various conversations arranged themselves to exclude her. She had told herself she would not attend this year. She had been telling herself this since August. Cole asked her on a Tuesday morning in the first week of December, 3 days before the dance, while he was replacing the hinge on her workroom door and she was at her work table with her back to him, which she recognized in retrospect was probably not a coincidence his timing. He said it simply and directly, without preamble in the way he did most things. "I would like to take you to the harvest dance, Clara, if you are willing." She kept her hands on what she was doing. "Cole," she said carefully. "I know what you are about to say," he said. He did not say it with impatience. He said it with a kind of patient precision, as though he had been waiting for this conversation and had given it considerable prior thought. "You are going to tell me that you appreciate the gesture, but that it is unnecessary, and that you do not require escorting, and possibly that a public association with a man of my particular profession and reputation would complicate your standing in this community, which is already complicated." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a reasonably accurate summary," she said. "I am not asking to protect your standing," he said. "I am asking because I want an evening in a room with you that is not this room which I like very much, but which is not the only room that exists. I am asking because you should be in that room, and you should be seen in it, and I would like to be the man standing next to you when you are." The hinge gave a small metallic sound as he settled it into place. Clara sat very still at her work table. "The dance is 3 days away," she said finally. "I am aware," he said. Another silence. Then she said, "I will need to press my good dress." He said nothing, but she heard or imagined she heard the slight controlled exhale of a man who has been holding his breath. She wore the green dress. She had made it herself 2 years ago from a bolt of deep forest green wool she had ordered from San Antonio, and it fit her the way a well-made garment fit a well-made figure, acknowledging the reality of her, rather than attempting to correct it. She wore her hair up with 2 carved combs that had belonged to her mother. She wore her good boots, the ones she kept polished and saved for occasions that rarely came. Cole came to her door at 7 o'clock in a coat she had not seen before, dark broadcloth, and a clean shirt, and his hat in his hand instead of on his head, and he looked at her in the doorway of her lamp-lit shop with an expression so unguarded that it stopped her mid-breath. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Clara." Just her name. But the way he said it made it something else entirely, made it a whole sentence, a declaration with grammar and weight and intention. "You look," he started, and then he stopped, and something moved across his face that was not his usual contained stillness, but something rawer and more honest. "There are not adequate words," he said. "I have ridden across a great deal of this state, and I have not encountered adequate words. I am sorry for the inadequacy." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Some weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was weight, and not just the shape of herself. "Your coat is very fine," she said, because she needed to say something manageable. The corner of his mouth moved. Mrs. Garland pressed it. "Give her my compliments." When he offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked together through the cold December night to the town hall, and she was aware with every step of the warmth of his arm under her hand, and the steadiness of him beside her, and the way the cold air carried the smell of wood smoke and dried grass, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she could not remember the last time she had been this present in her own body, this aware of herself as a person occupying a moment rather than simply moving through it toward whatever came next. The town hall was lit and warm and crowded. The fiddle band was already playing, and the floor was full of couples moving in the particular determined way of people who are enjoying themselves partly because they have decided to. Clara felt the shift in the room when she entered the small recalibration of eyes and attention, and she felt the familiar brace in herself, the preparation for the familiar experience. But Cole's arm was under her hand, and he walked beside her with the same unhurried, absolute self-possession he brought to everything, and the room could look all it liked, and he was entirely magnificently indifferent to its looking. They were perhaps 20 minutes into the evening, standing near the refreshment table, with cups of the hot spice cider that Mrs. Alderman made each year when Millicent Sterling appeared, and with her sister Josephine, and behind them, with the air of a man orchestrating something he expected to enjoy, Mayor Sterling himself. Millicent had outdone herself in a pale blue gown with an extremely managed silhouette, and she looked at Cole with the calculated warmth of a woman who has decided to deploy her advantages. She did not look at Clara. "Mr. Maverick," she said with a smile that had a great deal of work in it, "what a pleasant surprise to see you attending our social events. You must allow me to introduce you properly to some of the ladies present. I am sure there are many who would be delighted to partner with you for the next set." She tilted her head in a way that had probably worked on other men in other rooms. Real dancing deserves a real partner, after all. She had not looked at Clara once. The implication occupied the air between them, like smoke. Cole looked at Millicent Sterling. He looked at her with the full, calm, measuring regard of a man who has assessed considerably more dangerous things than a social slight in a decorated town hall and found them wanting. When he spoke, his voice was conversational and entirely without heat, which somehow made it more final than anger would have been. "Miss Sterling," he said, "I have a partner." Millicent's smile held but changed quality. "Of course, but I only thought that perhaps for one dance you might enjoy." "Miss Sterling," he said again. And the repetition was not impatient, it was simply conclusive, the way a door closing is conclusive. "I have a partner." He turned fully and deliberately away from Millicent Sterling and toward Clara, and the turning was itself a statement the kind that required no words. He looked at Clara with that direct, steady attention that had become one of the organizing facts of her recent life, and he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Would you dance with me, Clara?" She looked up at him. The fiddle band was beginning something slower. The lamplight was warm, and the room smelled of pine and cider and wood smoke, and Cole Maverick was standing in front of her with his hand extended and his eyes on hers with an expression that contained, if she was reading it correctly, everything he had not yet said and everything he intended to eventually. She took his hand. He danced the way he did everything else with an economy and sureness that suggested he was fully committed to what he was doing and saw no reason to perform it. He held her properly with one large hand at the curve of her waist, and if his hand rested there with a warmth and deliberateness that went somewhat beyond the requirements of the dance, she did not remark upon it. She was a full woman in a wool dress in a room that had spent 2 years making her feel like an imposition, and Cole Maverick was holding her as though she were something precious, and they moved together in the firelit room, and she felt for the first time in a very long time like a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. After the dance, he guided her outside onto the side porch that overlooked the dark slope of the hill behind the town hall, where the cold was sharp and clean, and the stars over the Texas hill country were abundant and indifferent to everything happening below them. She had her shawl, and he was close enough that his warmth was a presence alongside her, and they stood for a moment in the comfortable quiet that had always been one of the things she trusted most about him. Then he turned toward her slightly, and she turned toward him. And he lifted his hand and touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, with a tenderness so deliberate and so careful that she felt it in the base of her throat. His eyes moved over her face and then lower with an attention that was reverent in the original sense of the word, full of the specific gravity of a man encountering something he has long understood to be beyond what he deserved. His hand moved from her cheek to the curve of her shoulder, resting there with a weight that was not possessive, but grounding the way a hand rests on solid stone to confirm it is real. "I have been trying," he said slowly, "to find the words for this since November. I am not a man who has ever had much use for words. I have found this frustrating." "You do well enough," she said softly. "I want to do better than well enough," he said. "You deserve better than well enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I have spent my whole life eating when I could, and sleeping when it was safe, and moving on before anything could require me to stay. I have lived lean Clara in every sense of that word. Lean and hard and without much that was soft in it." He looked at her. His hand was still on her shoulder, steady and warm. I have spent a considerable part of 2 years trying to talk myself out of this, he said, telling myself that a woman like you had no need of a man like me, that what I could offer was too little, and what I carried was too much, that the blood on my history would only find its way onto yours. He exhaled slowly. I am not sure I have talked myself out of it. I am not sure I am capable of it. And I have found recently that I am not sure I want to be. Clara looked up at him. The stars were very bright. The cold pressed in around them, and his warmth held it at bay. I have been telling myself something similar, she said. That you would not want, when you thought about it clearly, a woman who looks as I look. That what I am is not what a man like you reaches for. Something moved across his face that was not quite pain, but was related to it. He shook his head slowly. Listen to me, he said, low and certain. I have ridden through this whole state, hungry, for sleep, for safety, for something that was not hard or dangerous or temporary. And I have found one thing in all of it that has ever felt like abundance. His hand moved from her shoulder to rest gently and deliberately at the fullest curve of her waist, and he held her gaze with an intensity that was completely without apology. I have spent my whole life starving Clara. You are a feast. Every soft, strong, brilliant inch of you is a feast. Do not ever, for their sake or anyone's sake, shrink yourself down to something you are not. The fiddle music came faintly through the wall of the town hall. The stars burned cold above them. Clara Whitfield stood in the December dark, with Cole Maverick's hand warm at her waist, and his words settling into her like medicine, finding the right wound, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for a very long time. Not everything, not all at once, but enough, a beginning. She placed her hand against his chest over the lapel of his pressed broadcloth coat and felt the steady beat of his heart under her palm. You are not, she said carefully, as poor with words as you believe. He covered her hand with his, pressing it gently against his chest, and looked at her, and did not say anything at all, which was in its way the most eloquent thing she had ever heard. They stayed on that porch in the cold while the dance continued inside, and the stars wheeled slowly over the hill country, and the night held them in its dark and quiet grace. And what passed between them there was not a declaration in any formal sense. It was simpler than that and larger than that. It was two people who had spent their lives learning to need nothing, finally admitting in the most private possible way that they needed this. The morning came as mornings do, without regard for what the night had meant. Clara woke in her small room behind the shop with the particular clarity of someone who has made a decision without fully acknowledging that a decision was made, and lay for a moment looking at the ceiling while Aristotle walked across her feet. Cole came to the shop at 8 as he had been doing. He brought her coffee from the boarding-house kitchen because he had learned that she made her own, but that she preferred not to on mornings after late evenings. He set the cup on her counter, and she took it, and they stood in the early light of her shop without speaking, and it was the most natural thing in the world. At noon he told her he had to go. She had been expecting it in the way you expect weather when you know it is coming, and still it arrived with a particular cold. There is a man, he said, and the economy of that told her everything she needed to know about the nature of the business. He has been tracking me between jobs. I have been letting him come. It is time to resolve it. Resolve it, she said. The words were careful in her mouth. I will not let it reach you, he said, with a directness that was not a reassurance but a statement of intent, which was more valuable. But I need to intercept him away from here, away from this place. His eyes moved around the shop and came back to her. Away from you. She wanted to say several things. She said instead, "How long?" "3 days. Perhaps 4. She nodded. She was a practical woman. She understood necessity. She went to her workroom and put together a kit for him, the things a man might need in 3 or 4 days of hard travel and whatever waited at the end of it. She did it with the same focused care she brought to everything medical, each item chosen for a reason, and when she handed it to him across the counter, she held on for one extra moment before she let go. He noticed. He always noticed. "Clara," he said. "Come back," she said. Quietly and directly, with no performance in it in the way he had taught her, was the best way to say the thing you meant. "Come back to Oakhaven. I will be here." He looked at her with that look, the one she had stopped pretending she did not understand. He picked up the kit and his saddlebags. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame, and turned back once the way he had never turned back when he left from the dusk visits before all of this had begun. 3 days, he said. The door closed. The bell rang, and the silence that followed was of the particular kind that a room holds when something important has recently occupied it and left a shape behind in the air. She stood at her counter, and she breathed, and she was steady because she was Clara Whitfield, and steadiness was the architecture of her life, and she was steady. But her hand where she had held the kit a moment longer than necessary was warm, and she was aware of it, and she let herself be aware of it for just that moment, before she picked up her work and carried on. 40 miles away, a man she did not know was moving toward Oakhaven with bad intentions and a long memory, and Mayor Harlan Sterling was sitting in his locked office with a railroad contract and a plan, and the world that had spent 2 years trying to make Clara Whitfield feel small was preparing in its blind and self-serving way to make one final catastrophic mistake. The first day of Cole's absence passed the way first days do when you are waiting for something slowly and with an excess of awareness. Clara noticed the silence in a different way than she usually did. The shop was the same. The jars were in their rows. The stove was burning. Aristotle was on the windowsill conducting his surveillance of Main Street with his usual professional seriousness. Everything was exactly as it had always been, and yet the particular quality of the quiet had changed the way a room changes when something that had been furnishing it without your full knowledge is temporarily removed. She worked. This was what she did with difficult feelings and uncertain waiting, and the particular vulnerability of having let someone matter to her in a way she could not fully retract. She inventoried her stock and updated her ledger, and prepared 3 orders for the supply wagon, coming at the end of the week. She made a poultice for the Miller boy, who had a burn on his forearm from a cooking fire, and she made it with the same precise attention she brought to everything, because her patients deserved her full mind, regardless of what the rest of her was doing. She was efficient and composed, and she did not look at the door more than was reasonable. The second day brought cold weather, a hard gray sky pressing down over the hill country with the particular weight of a northern building to the northwest, and it brought Mrs. Calvert, the rancher's wife from the property, 6 miles south of town, who came in through the back door in the middle of the afternoon with a tightness around her eyes that Clara recognized as a woman trying very hard not to show how frightened she was. The Calverts ran 300 head on good grassland that had been in the family since before the war. Mrs. Calvert was a capable, weathered woman in her mid-40s who had always treated Clara with the straightforward respect of someone who valued competence above social convention. Clara liked her. She sat Mrs. Calvert down at the table in the workroom and poured her tea and waited. 4 of our best cattle are dead, Mrs. Calvert said. In 3 weeks. John thinks it is the water. He sent samples to the assay office in San Antonio, but we have not heard back. And meanwhile, the Hendersons lost 2 animals last month, and the Garcias before that, and no one can say why. Clara was still. Which water source? The creek that runs along the north boundary. It is shared with the Henderson spread. The Garcia land runs south of there, different watershed, but—" She stopped. "But they lost animals, too, in the fall." "What were the symptoms?" Clara asked, and Mrs. Calvert described them, and Clara listened with the full, focused attention that was one of her finest professional qualities, the ability to hear not just what was said, but what the pattern of it meant. She asked 4 precise questions. She got her answer before Mrs. Calvert had finished. "I need to think about this carefully before I say anything definite," Clara said. "The assay results will tell you more than I can without them, but I want you to move your remaining cattle off the North Creek water immediately. Use the south tank until you hear back from San Antonio." Mrs. Calvert looked at her with that frightened tightness still around her eyes. "Is it what I think it is?" Clara met her gaze. "Move the cattle today," she said. After Mrs. Calvert left, Clara sat at her work table for a long time. The pattern she had heard described was not complicated not to someone with her training. The symptoms in the cattle, the progression, the timeline, the fact that it was tracking along shared water sources through adjacent properties. She had read about this. She had read about it in a medical journal and in 2 agricultural texts, and she had hoped in the abstract way you hope about things you expect never to encounter directly, that she would never see it in practice. Arsenic poisoning did not look like accident once you knew what you were looking at. It looked like someone who had access to the water supply and a reason to want the land above it empty of its owners. She thought about Mayor Sterling and his careful orchestrated campaign against her. She thought about the railroad surveyors she had seen twice in the past month, strangers with instruments, men who did not linger or explain themselves. She thought about the pattern of land adjacent to her corner lot, the ranches that surrounded the town on the south and west, the land that a railroad would need to cross to reach Oakhaven from the direction of San Antonio. She was still sitting with these thoughts when the 3rd day arrived, and the weather broke open. It came in the night, not a storm exactly, but a sustained battering wind out of the northwest that shook the town and made the sign above her door keen and rattle on its bracket. Clara slept poorly and woke before dawn and lay in the gray pre-light listening to the wind work at the eaves of her building. She had a feeling she could not name precisely the kind of anticipatory unease that her body sometimes produced before something difficult arrived, like a change in barometric pressure that only she could read. She rose at first light. She stoked the stove. She made coffee. She was standing at the front window with her cup watching Main Street come alive in the hard morning wind when she heard it, a sound that was not wind coming from the alley beside her building. She was through the back door before she had fully decided to go, because the sound had a quality that her body recognized as wrong before her mind had processed it into language, and she was someone who had learned to trust that recognition. The alley was empty. But the back door of her shop, the one that led to her workroom, was standing open at an angle she had not left it. She stopped. She stood very still in the cold alley and listened and looked and understood in the sudden awful clarity of it what she was looking at. The door was open. There was broken glass visible on the workroom floor through the opening, and there was no sound from inside. She went in. What they had done to her shop was not random. That was the thing she understood immediately, standing in the doorway of her workroom with her hand against the frame. Random destruction has a different quality, a wildness and emotional excess. This was methodical. This was the destruction of a specific purpose, which was to make the shop non-functional and the work of recovery so overwhelming that the obvious conclusion was to give up and leave. Her mortar and pestle, both of them, were shattered on the floor. Her scale, the good brass one she had saved for 2 years to purchase, was bent beyond repair. The glass jars had been swept from the shelves in their rows, and the contents mixed on the floor into a ruined, useless amalgam of 2 years of careful supply. The small oak cabinet where she kept her tinctures had been overturned, and the bottles inside it had broken, and the smell that rose from the floor was the complicated, wasted scent of a dozen medicinal compounds that would take months to replace. Her reference texts had been pulled from their shelf and dropped in the liquid from the broken tinctures. The pages were already bloating and warping. Her front room was worse, or rather, it was worse in a different way. The counter was cracked along its length. The display shelves were cleared. The window that faced Main Street had a crack running from the lower right corner up through the glass like a jagged scar. Clara stood in the middle of her ruined front room and looked at it. She did not make a sound. She was aware that she was breathing because she was making herself do it deliberately in and out the way she breathed when she needed to remain functional in the presence of something that wanted to undo her. She was not going to be undone. She was also not going to do anything else until she had looked at all of it, because she was an apothecary, and she believed in full examination before treatment, and the full examination of this particular damage was something she owed herself. She looked at all of it. She looked at the broken glass and the wasted medicine and the ruined texts and the cracked counter and the split window, and she felt beneath the grief and the fury something that she recognized after a moment as familiar. This was the thing Oakhaven had always been trying to do to her, the reduction, the diminishment, the message that she did not belong here, and never had, and should stop insisting on it. They had used whispers before. They had used paint on her front step. Now they had used hired hands in the night, and the escalation told her something important about the desperation behind it. Desperate people made mistakes. She got her broom. She started at the back and worked forward because that was the practical way to do it, and because she needed to move and work and be useful, and because the alternative was to stand still in the middle of the wreckage and give whoever had ordered this the satisfaction of having broken something essential in her. She was not broken. She was furious and grieving, and her hands were shaking slightly, but she was not broken, and she intended to demonstrate that with every stroke of the broom. She had been working for perhaps an hour, clearing the worst of the debris from the workroom floor into manageable piles when the broom struck something solid under the overturned cabinet. She moved the cabinet aside, which required considerable effort, and found beneath it a tin box she had never seen before. It had been placed there deliberately. That was obvious from the way it was positioned, set against the back wall where the cabinet had stood, in a space where it would only be found if the cabinet was moved. Someone had used the cover of the ransacking to hide it, or had hidden it before the ransacking began, anticipating that the chaos would serve as concealment. She crouched down and looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then she picked it up and carried it to the work table and opened it. Inside were papers. A collection of receipts, 9 of them, written in a purchasing clerk's hand, itemizing transactions for a compound identified by its trade name from a chemical supplier in Austin. The quantities were substantial, far beyond any agricultural or domestic use. The receipts were made out to a series of names, different names on each. But the delivery address on 5 of them was a warehouse on the south side of Oakhaven that Clara recognized as a property owned by a holding company she had seen listed in the town records when she registered her own deed. A holding company whose principles she had learned through the unremarkable process of paying attention to local records over 2 years was Mayor Harlan Sterling. She read them twice. She set them down. She read them a third time. The arsenic that was killing the Calvert cattle and the Henderson cattle and whatever else was failing and dying along those creek systems had been purchased in quantity through a series of false names delivered to a property owned by the mayor and was being used to contaminate the water sources on the ranch land that surrounded the western and southern approaches to Oakhaven. The land that a railroad would need to cross. The land whose owners, once their livestock was dying and their water was poisoned, would be desperate to sell at whatever price they were offered. The mayor was not just trying to push Clara off her corner lot. He was poisoning this valley to clear it for the railroad, and he had been doing it for months, and people's livelihoods and animals, and possibly eventually people themselves, were at risk. She sat with this knowledge for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she heard hoofbeats on the street outside, the particular cadence of a horse she recognized, and the front door opened, and Cole Maverick stood in the doorway of her ruined shop. He stood there and looked at the cracked counter, and the empty shelves, and the split window, and the systematic devastation of the place that was her life, and she watched his face go through something, a brief, complete, visible passage, through something cold and absolute, before it settled into the stillness he wore as his public self. His jaw was tight. His eyes, when they found hers across the wreckage, were the color of a sky before lightning. He was there in 3 strides. His hands came up to her face, turning it gently, checking for injury, with the thoroughness of a man who had been terrified of something specific and needed to verify it had not occurred. "I am not hurt," she said. "They came in the night. I was in my quarters." His hands stilled on either side of her face. He was very close. He exhaled slowly, the controlled release of something he had been holding hard. "I will find them," he said, and his voice had a quality that was different from his usual quiet, lower stripped of all its social veneer down to the essential thing underneath. "I will find every one of them, and I will make it clear that this is never to happen again." "Cole," she said. "Clara, they destroyed your work, your life, everything you built." "I know what they destroyed," she said steadily. "I swept it up myself. And I need you to listen to me now." Something in her voice reached him. She saw him hear it, the command in it not desperate or frightened, but precise. He looked at her. She stepped back from his hands, not rejecting them, but freeing herself to think clearly, and she walked to the work table and picked up the receipts and handed them to him. He read them. He was a man who had spent years piecing together trails from fragments of evidence, and he read them quickly and completely, and she watched his expression as he understood what they were. "Sterling," he said. "Sterling," she confirmed. "He has been poisoning the rancher's water supply. The cattle deaths the sick livestock. It is not disease. It is arsenic in the creek systems. I believe he intends to force the ranchers to sell their land for the railroad route at collapsed prices. My corner lot is only one piece of it." Cole looked at the receipts in his hand and then at her face. "The marshal," she said. "The U.S. Marshal, not the town sheriff. Sterling has the sheriff. But a federal case on land fraud and deliberate poisoning of public water sources is outside the sheriff's jurisdiction. I need the town hall meeting tomorrow night because every rancher in the affected area will be there for the quarterly land registry review. I need to put these receipts in front of all of them at once in public, on record." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. It was not the reverence of the porch in December, though that was somewhere in it. It was something harder and more admiring, the look of a man who is watching someone he already respected reveal a depth he had not fully calculated. "You want to face him publicly," Cole said. "I want to end this publicly," she said, "permanently, in a way that cannot be undone or quietly buried after the fact. Sterling has managed this town through privacy and whispers for 11 years. I intend to remove both of those tools from him in front of every person whose life he has been destroying." Cole was quiet for a moment. "He will have men there. He will try to interrupt, discredit, remove you." "I know," she said. "That is why I am asking you to come with me." "You are not asking me to fight," he said. "I am asking you to stand at the door," she said, "with your hand on your gun and that particular look you have." The one that communicates that a man would be making a serious error in judgment if he tried to remove me from that room before I have finished speaking." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a moment for smiling, and yet it was. "I can do that," he said. She nodded. She looked around her ruined shop at the empty shelves and the cracked counter and the floor she had swept clean of the debris of 2 years of careful work. It would take money and time and effort to rebuild. She had all three, or she would find them. She had rebuilt from less. "Help me board the window," she said, "and then I am going to need to speak to Mrs. Calvert and the Hendersons before tomorrow night." He put the receipts carefully inside his coat against his chest, the same place he had put her recovery instructions the morning he rode away from his fever, and she noticed this, and noted it, in the way she noted everything about him now, with the careful attentiveness of a woman who had stopped pretending she was not paying attention. They worked side by side for the rest of the day. He boarded the window, and she sorted what could be salvaged from the wreckage, and Aristotle supervised both operations from the top of the overturned cabinet with an air of judicial authority. Clara sent notes to Mrs. Calvert and 2 other ranching families she trusted, asking them to come to her shop that evening, and by the time the last thin light was leaving the sky over Oakhaven, she had spoken to 4 ranchers whose water she now had reason to believe was compromised and who listened to what she told them, with the focused, growing fury of people who have been damaged in a way they can finally name. By 9 o'clock that evening, she had 3 ranchers committed to attending the town hall meeting of the following night and bringing their own evidence of livestock loss and water damage. By 10, she had written out in her precise, clear hand a complete accounting of the arsenic receipts, their amounts, their delivery addresses, and their correlation with the pattern of animal deaths she had documented from Mrs. Calvert and the others. She was sitting at her work table with the lamp burning low over the papers when Cole came through from the front room where he had been completing some reinforcement to the cracked counterframe. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her bent over her papers in the lamplight, her hair coming loose from its pins, her dress still carrying the dust and debris of a day spent working through catastrophe. She looked up and found him watching her with that expression she was learning the name of. She was tired, genuinely tired, in the deep way that came from a day of sustained effort against something that had wanted to defeat her. And he was there, solid and present in the doorway of her workroom that smelled of spilled tinctures and wood smoke, and the particular resilient scent of a place that has been damaged but not destroyed. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said, "when I have finished this." He looked at the papers and at her face, and he said quietly, "Clara, you are going to walk into that room tomorrow, and you are going to take that man apart, with the truth in front of the whole town. I know this with complete certainty." He paused. "But you cannot do it running on 3 hours and a broken night. Finish the summary. Then sleep. The truth will still be true in the morning." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at her papers and wrote 3 more precise sentences, set the pen down, and stacked the pages neatly. "I am finished," she said. He extinguished the front lamp while she banked the stove, and she heard him settle into the chair in the front room, the one where he had sat during his recovery, where he had been sitting for weeks now, in one form or another, and she understood that he intended to stay there through the night. She did not tell him this was unnecessary. It was not unnecessary. She went to her small room and lay down in the dark and listened to the wind move through Oakhaven and thought about tomorrow, about the town hall meeting and the receipts in Cole's coat and the ranchers who would be there and the mayor who had no idea what was coming for him in the form of one powerfully built woman in a green wool dress with 2 years of compressed fury and a stack of documented evidence and absolutely nothing left to lose. She slept. She slept well. And in the morning she rose and pinned her hair and dressed with care and went to her work table and picked up her papers and she was ready. The morning of the town hall meeting was cold and clear, the kind of December morning that the hill country produced when it wanted to remind you that beauty and severity were not opposites, but companions. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the frost on the boardwalks caught the early light and held it, and the air had that clean, knife-edge quality that made everything feel more actual than usual, more precisely itself. Clara dressed with the deliberateness of a woman who understood that appearance in a public confrontation was not vanity but strategy. She wore the green dress again because she had worn it on the best night of her recent life, and she intended to associate it now with the best morning of her public one. She pinned her hair with care. She wore her good boots. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, and she held her own gaze for a moment with the steady, measured regard she usually reserved for problems she was about to solve. She picked up her papers from the work table. She put on her coat. She walked through the front room of her damaged shop, past the boarded window and the cracked counter and the empty shelves that were already in her mind, filling again with the work of rebuilding, and she went out the front door onto Main Street, in the cold, brilliant morning. Ooh. Cole was waiting on the boardwalk. He had his coat and his hat, and the particular quality of stillness that he wore when he was prepared for something difficult. He looked at her when she came out, a full and direct look that took in the green dress and the pinned hair and the papers in her hand, and her expression, and what moved across his face was something she was learning to read fluently. Now, a combination of pride and protectiveness and something warmer than both. He did not say anything. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked together toward the town hall in the clear, cold morning, and Oakhaven watched them come. The quarterly Land Registry Review was one of the best-attended civic events on the Oakhaven calendar, because it was one of the few occasions when the legal status of a man's land was publicly confirmed, and in a cattle town on the edge of the frontier, a man's land was as close to sacred as most things got. The ranching families came in from miles out. The merchants attended. The aldermen sat at the long table at the front of the room. And Mayor Harlan Sterling presided, as he always had, from the raised chair at the center, with the comfortable authority of a man who had been the largest and best-connected person in a small room for so long that he had forgotten rooms could change size. He did not see Clara coming. This was his central fatal error, and it was the error of a man who had spent 11 years looking at Clara Whitfield and seeing only what he had decided she was. He had seen a woman he could pressure and isolate and outlast. He had seen an obstacle. He had never once in all of his strategic thinking considered that she might see him just as clearly as he saw her, and that what she saw was not impressive. The room was full when she and Cole arrived. She could feel the attention shift when she entered the familiar recalibration, but tonight it had a different quality than it usually did. Tonight, some of the people watching her enter were the ranchers she had spoken to the previous evening, the Calverts, the Hendersons, a third family named Briggs, who had lost 6 animals and nearly lost a child to contaminated water in October, and had not known until Clara told them why. Their eyes found hers and held, and in them she saw the same thing she felt in herself, a fury that had been waiting for direction and had finally found it. She walked to the center of the room. She did not go to the side. She did not take a seat against the wall. She walked to the center of the room where the lamplight fell fully, and everyone present could see her, and she stood there with her papers in her hand and her shoulders straight and waited. Cole went to the door. He stood with his back at an angle to the frame, his right hand resting at his side in the vicinity of his gun, with the completely relaxed quality of a man who has no immediate intention of using it and an absolute willingness to change that assessment. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed one boot over the other and looked out over the room with an expression of mild, comprehensive attention that several of the larger men present found upon encountering it sufficient reason to remain in their seats. Mayor Sterling called the meeting to order and began the procedural opening, the routine announcements, the formal registration items, the comfortable apparatus of a civic event he had conducted many times and expected to conduct many times more. He was a large, florid man in a good suit, with the kind of voice trained to fill rooms and the kind of manner trained to imply that filling rooms was his natural right. He had noticed Clara. She saw his eyes find her when she came in, saw the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his expression, the recalculation. He had noticed Cole at the door as well, and she watched him decide in the way powerful men decide things in public that he would manage this, that he had managed more difficult situations than a shopkeeper and a hired gun, and that the meeting would proceed on his terms. He was midway through the second agenda item when Clara said clearly and without preliminary, "Mayor Sterling." The room went quiet. Sterling looked at her with the expression of a man exercising patience he considers generous. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his tone put her in her place, or attempted to. "The public comment portion of the meeting is scheduled for the end of the agenda. I would ask you to wait your turn." "I am afraid this cannot wait for the end of the agenda," she said in the same clear, steady voice. "What I have to say is relevant to several of the land registry items on your agenda, and the families affected have a right to hear it before those items are confirmed." There was a murmur in the room. Sterling's expression moved through impatience towards something sharper. "Miss Whitfield, I must insist." "Mayor Sterling." Her voice was not loud. It was precise, and it carried through the room with the authority of a woman who had spent 2 years being talked over and had decided definitively that this was the last time. "I have documented evidence of arsenic purchases made under false names delivered to a property you own correlating directly with the pattern of water contamination and livestock deaths affecting the Calvert Henderson and Briggs spreads over the past 4 months. I intend to present this evidence to this room tonight. You may call it out of order if you wish, but I will note that attempting to silence this presentation in front of this many witnesses would not serve your interests particularly well." The silence that followed was of a quality that Clara had never heard in a room. Before the specific silence of many people becoming very still because they have just understood that something real is happening. Sterling rose from his chair. He was a large man, and he used his size deliberately, the way large men in positions of power learn to use it. "This is an outrageous," he began. "Mr. Calvert," Clara said, turning to the rancher in the third row, "would you please tell this room how many animals you have lost in the past 6 weeks, and from which water source?" John Calvert stood. He was a weathered, quiet man who had worked his land for 20 years and was not given to drama, and his composure made what he said more devastating than any outrage could have. He told the room, 7 cattle dead, the North Creek water, a pattern that had started in October and continued until he moved the herd off that water source at Clara's instruction 3 days ago. "Mr. Henderson," Clara said. Henderson stood. 5 animals, the shared creek boundary. His eldest son had been ill for 2 weeks in November with symptoms that the town doctor had attributed to a stomach complaint and that Clara now understood were consistent with low-level arsenic exposure. His son had recovered. Henderson's voice when he said this was the voice of a man who was very carefully maintaining his composure. "Mrs. Briggs," Clara said. Margaret Briggs stood. She did not speak for a moment. She had a daughter 9 years old who had been gravely ill in October. The town doctor had said it was fever. Clara had asked her the previous evening about the child's water sources that month and what she had found when she looked at her own well and Mrs. Briggs told the room now in the flat contained voice of a mother who has looked at how close she came to something and is still processing the dimensions of it. The room was not silent anymore. It had a sound now, a low building sound that was not quite speech and not quite anything else, the sound of people absorbing something terrible. Clara set her papers on the alderman's table. Not on Sterling's raised platform, on the alderman's table where they belonged, where official records and civic evidence belonged in front of the men who had the authority to act on them. These are copies of 9 receipts from a chemical supplier in Austin, she said to the room, to the alderman, to the full body of Oakhaven assembled under these lamps. Each receipt documents a purchase of arsenic in quantities that have no domestic or standard agricultural application. Each is made out under a different name. 5 of them list a delivery address at a warehouse on the south side of this town in the name of a holding company whose principal owner is Mayor Harlan Sterling. She paused. She let the room hold that. I am not an attorney. I am not a law officer. I am the apothecary who has been treating the families in this room for 2 years, and I am telling you as a medical professional and as a member of this community that the pattern of illness and animal death you have witnessed on the ranches surrounding the western and southern approaches to Oakhaven is consistent with deliberate, sustained arsenic contamination of shared water sources. And the motive is not complicated. A railroad is coming. The land those families stand on is in its path, and someone needed them desperate enough to sell. The sound in the room had changed again. It was sharper now. Several people were standing. The alderman at the far end of the table had picked up the receipts and was reading them with the expression of a man who would very much have preferred not to be in possession of this information and understood that he had no choice but to be. Sterling was on his feet. His composure had not broken entirely because he was a man with a great deal of practice at maintaining composure, but it had cracked in several visible places, and through the cracks something less controlled was showing. He said in the voice he used when he was deciding to be powerful, "These documents are fabrications. This woman has a personal grievance against this office, as the entire town is aware, and she is manufacturing." "The receipts can be verified with the supplier in Austin," Clara said. She was not raising her voice. She did not need to. "The warehouse can be inspected. The water sources can be tested by an independent assay office, and I have already sent samples to San Antonio." She looked at Sterling directly across the room, the first time she had ever looked at him as an equal, addressing another equal. "You destroyed my shop, Mayor Sterling. You sent men in the night to break my equipment and ruin my stock and make it clear that Oakhaven had no place for me. What you could not have anticipated was that when I swept up the wreckage, I would find what you had hidden behind my cabinet. What you could not have calculated was that 2 years of using my back door and trusting my discretion had made these families willing to speak to me. You treated me as invisible for 2 years. That was your mistake." Sterling's face had gone a color that Clara noted clinically as not healthy. He looked at her, and then at the receipts in the alderman's hands, and then at the room which was full of people who were no longer looking at him the way a room looks at its largest person, but looking at him the way a room looks at something that has been identified. He looked at the door. Cole Maverick was still there, one shoulder against the frame, hand resting easy at his side, watching Sterling with an expression of absolute, patient, comprehensive calm. He was not threatening. He was simply immovably present in the manner of something geological. He met Sterling's eyes and did not look away, and Sterling, who was a man accustomed to men looking away, went still. The room erupted, not in violence, but in the particular productive chaos of a community that has been deceived, discovering its deception. The voices of aldermen calling for order, and ranchers demanding answers, and the town clerk asking twice whether the marshal's office had been contacted, and someone in the back saying that they ought to contact the marshal's office right now this evening, and someone else saying they knew where to find the deputy. Clara stood in the center of it. She had delivered what she had come to deliver. Her papers were on the alderman's table. The truth was in the room, and it was not going back out of it, and she was covered in the metaphorical dust of a 2-year fight and the literal residue of a shop she had spent the previous day cleaning, and she was still standing, and that was enough for this moment. She felt Cole cross the room toward her before she saw him, because she had developed over these months a specific awareness of him in physical space. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her in the same position he had always taken, making room for her to be the largest thing in whatever room she was in. "You are all right," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am all right," she said. "Yes." He stood with her while the room moved around them, and it was some time before either of them spoke again. The marshal arrived in Oakhaven 2 days later, called by a wire sent by the head alderman that same evening, and he was a precise, deliberate man from San Antonio named Garrett, who listened to the evidence with the focused attention of a professional and asked 8 very good questions and issued a warrant for Mayor Sterling's arrest on the 3rd day, which happened to be the day the assay results came back from San Antonio confirming arsenic in the North Creek water at levels consistent with deliberate introduction. Sterling's arraignment drew most of Oakhaven. Clara did not attend. She was in her shop, which was in the process of being rebuilt, working with 2 carpenters she had hired, and the considerable energy of someone who has been angry for a long time and now has somewhere useful to put it. The new shelves were going up. She had placed an order for replacement glassware. The oak counter was being replaced with one of a better quality because she had decided while sweeping the ruins that she was going to build back stronger than she had built the first time. The Calvert family sent a side of beef. The Hendersons sent a note and a cash contribution toward her rebuilding costs that she tried to refuse, and they insisted upon. Margaret Briggs came in person and sat in the workroom and held Clara's hands across the work table for a moment without saying anything, which was the right thing to do, and then said simply that they would not forget, and Clara said simply that she was glad the child was well, and that was enough. On the 4th day after the town hall meeting, Cole came to the shop at the end of the working day and found her alone. The carpenters, having finished for the afternoon, sitting in the rocking chair by the back window with Aristotle in her lap and her feet up and her eyes closed, and the expression of a person who has been through something very large and has come out the other side and is, for just this moment, allowing herself to be still. She heard him come in. She did not open her eyes immediately. "The shelves look good," he said. "They are better than the old ones," she said. "I moved the tincture section to the east wall. Better light." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him set something down on the new counter, a sound she had not heard before, and opened her eyes. He was standing with his saddlebags on the counter. He was wearing his traveling coat. His hat was in his hand. She looked at the saddlebags. She felt something that she identified with the clarity she brought to hard things as the specific pain of anticipating a loss that has not yet fully arrived. "There is a contract," she said. She kept her voice steady. "No," he said. She looked at him. "There is no contract," he said. He was looking at her with an expression that was the most unguarded she had ever seen on him, in fever or in firelight or under December stars, the expression of a man who has removed every layer he owns and is standing in the cold of what he actually is. "I am packing my bags because I am a man who has lived out of saddlebags for 15 years, and I do not know how to stop doing something that has become a habit, even when the habit no longer serves me. I packed them this morning, and then I sat with them for 4 hours, and I have come to tell you something." Clara was very still. "I am afraid," he said. It came out plainly with no apology for its plainness. "I am not afraid of the things most men are afraid of. I am afraid of this, of staying somewhere, of being something that can be counted on and reached, and hurt. I am afraid that I will track mud through whatever peace you have made for yourself here. That my history will find you. That what I am in the dark will eventually diminish what you are in the light. He paused. I have been afraid of this since the first November I rode into this town and smelled sage and camphor through an open door and felt for the first time in years something I can only describe as the direction of home. The rocking chair was still. Aristotle had transferred himself to the floor with the dignity of a creature who understood this was a human moment requiring space. Cole, Clara said, I know I am not what you would have chosen if you had been given a catalog, he said. I know I am scarred and hard-edged and without the kind of settled history that a woman like you deserves in a man. I know all of this. Do you know, she said carefully and precisely, what I actually think of you? Or are you working from the version you invented to protect yourself from hoping for something? He was quiet. I think, she said, rising from the rocking chair, that you are the most attentive person I have ever met. I think that you have treated me from the first evening you set $2 silver on my counter as a person worthy of full regard. I think that you have brought me plants from the far side of the river and fixed my door hinge without being asked, and stood at a doorway when I needed you there, and you have never not once looked at me the way this town looks at me. She crossed the room to where he stood and stopped in front of him and looked up at his face with the directness that was one of the essential things about her. I am a practical woman, Cole. I do not reach for things I cannot have. But I have been reaching for this for longer than I will admit, and I am asking you now to put down the saddlebags. He looked at her. His jaw worked once. The expression on his face was the expression of a man receiving something he had been telling himself for a very long time was not available to him. His hands came up slowly and cupped her face the way they had on the porch in December with that extraordinary care, as though she were something that could be frightened off by suddenness. He looked at her face, all of it, the warm brown eyes and the strong jaw, and the particular quality of her gaze, which was the most honest thing he had ever been looked at with. Stay, she said. I have a room that needs occupying, and a supply route that needs managing, and a medicinal garden that needs expanding, and I am very tired of doing everything alone. Stay, Cole. Make your life here. Let me make mine alongside yours. He drew her in. Not suddenly, not with any excess of drama, but with the complete and deliberate tenderness of a man who understands that he is holding the most valuable thing he has ever found and intends to be worthy of it. He held her full and strong and abundant self, with both arms around her and his face against her hair, and she felt him exhale against her, the same exhale she had heard on the night she saved his life, the sound of something long held finally released. I am not easy to live with, he said into her hair. I have a cat who hisses at judges, she said against his shoulder. My standards for domestic temperament are already established. She felt the movement in his chest that was his version of a laugh, rare and genuine, and completely unperformed, and she noted it with the part of her that noted everything about him, filed it away in the same careful place she kept all the other true things about him. He did not leave. The saddlebags went into the storeroom, and that evening they sat on opposite sides of the work table, and she told him what she needed in terms of medicinal supply routes north toward the river country and east toward the trade roads from San Antonio, and he listened and asked practical questions and made 2 suggestions about route timing that were genuinely useful because he knew that country better than anyone and because his mind, once applied to a problem with clear parameters, was quick and precise in ways that still surprised her. 3 days later, he came back from the livery with a second horse, a steady gray mare, he introduced as a pack animal for the supply runs, and he looked slightly self-conscious, presenting this in the manner of a man offering something that matters more than he wants to show. And Clara looked at the horse and then at him and said seriously, "She will need a name." And he said, "I thought you might want to name her." And Clara considered for a moment and said, "Margaret." And he looked at her and she said, "After Mrs. Briggs." She held my hands. "It seems right." And Cole looked at the gray mare and then back at Clara and said, "Margaret, it is," with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has made the right decision and is beginning slowly to believe he will not be punished for it. 1 year later, the corner of Main and Sycamore in Oakhaven, Texas, had changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. The apothecary had new shelves and new glass and a new counter of good quality oak, and a small hand-painted sign above the door that was slightly better than the old one. The medicinal garden behind the building had expanded along the south wall and was producing 3 varieties of herb that Clara had not been able to source reliably the previous year. The cat Aristotle had at some point in the preceding months decided to tolerate Cole's presence in his domain with an air of magnanimous permission that Cole accepted with complete seriousness. Cole ran 2 supply routes, now north and east, with Margaret the Gray Mare and Breckenridge, and he knew the roads between Oakhaven and the river country and the trade road south as well as he had ever known any territory in his tracking years, but differently now, not as a man passing through, but as a man who knew where he was going, and more importantly, where he was going back to. He had a reputation on the routes as reliable and fair, and not to be tested, which served the business well and suited his nature completely. He was not, as he had warned her, easy to live with in the conventional sense. He was quiet in ways that some people found opaque. He was alert in ways that occasionally startled people who came to the shop unexpectedly. He had a history that had not entirely resolved itself, and probably never would. And there were nights when whatever lived in that history visited him and Clara, who was a medical professional and a perceptive woman, and someone who loved him with the same steady, practical, absolute quality she brought to everything she valued, was present for those nights without making them more complicated than they needed to be. He was in the ways that mattered the easiest person she had ever known. He saw her completely. He said what he meant. He fixed things that needed fixing without requiring acknowledgement. He brought her things from his roots with the focused thoughtfulness of a man who was always in some corner of his attention thinking about what she needed. He looked at her every day with the same directness he had always looked at her with, as though she were the most interesting landscape he had ever surveyed, and he had not finished studying it. On a clear December morning, exactly 1 year after the harvest dance, Clara Whitfield, who was now Clara Maverick, by a ceremony conducted by the circuit judge in the front room of the apothecary with Mrs. Calvert and John Henderson and Aristotle as witnesses, stood at the window of her rebuilt shop and watched her husband ride Margaret and Breckenridge up Main Street from the north route, 2 weeks of supply work behind him, and she felt the particular quality of feeling that she had spent 2 years telling herself was not available to her, and which had turned out to be not only available, but structural, the foundation of everything else. Cole came through the front door with the cold of the road still on his coat, and found her at the window. And he crossed the room and kissed her with the uncomplicated directness of a man who has come home to the only home he has ever chosen. And she put her hand against his chest, over his heart, and felt it beating steady under her palm. "Good root?" she asked. "Found wild valerian on the north bank again," he said. "Good yield this year, too." "You say that every year. It keeps being true." She looked up at him. He looked back at her. The shelves were full behind her, and the stove was burning, and Aristotle was on the windowsill, and the hill country winter light came through the new glass and lay across the floor of the shop in long, warm bars, and the corner of Main and Sycamore in Oakhaven, Texas, was exactly as it had always been and entirely, irrevocably different. The greatest bounty hunter in 3 counties had found, after 15 years of hard roads and harder winters, the only thing he had ever tracked that he did not know he was looking for, and he had been wise enough when he found it not to ride away.